Hello, and welcome to the Three Questions podcast, where we dive deep into the world of wealth management and connect you with industry experts. I'm your host, Wayne Baxter, Senior Executive Manager at One Capital Management. Now, if you or someone close to you runs a nonprofit organization or wishes to make a significant donation to one, stay tuned. Our topic, the three questions a nonprofit should ask when receiving a large charitable donation. Thank you for taking time to check us out. And if you enjoy this episode of the Three Questions podcast, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our podcast and YouTube channels. Over the past 25 years, nonprofits have provided essential services like healthcare, education, and disaster relief, often filling gaps left by government and private sectors. According to recent data, in 2023 alone, individual donors here in the U.S. have given an estimated $374 billion, with a B, billion dollars to nonprofits. And that's about 67% of the total charitable giving of around $557 billion. Donors with an adjusted gross income of between $100,000 and $500,000 a year gave approximately $3,300 per capita per year. This group raises the most total dollars for nonprofits due to their size and obviously giving capacity. Now, from time to time, there is a raving fan that emerges who wishes to make a significant donation. And by significant, we'll say maybe 100,000, 500,000, or even more. For those who run a nonprofit, a large donation obviously creates some big opportunities, but also complexities. And today we're going to discuss the three questions a nonprofit should ask when receiving a large charitable donation. And joining us from Manhattan, New York, aka the Big Apple, is Jennifer Abelai. She's the founder of Abelai Law PC, and Jennifer has significant experience advising high net worth clients, both domestic and with international footprint. And she has worked with nonprofit boards, executive directors, and lobbying groups. And Jennifer, you know what? I'm really glad to have met you and have an opportunity to have you here on the Three Questions podcast. Great to see you.
Great. So good to see you. Thank you for having me on. I'm really excited about this conversation we're going to have.
Well, you know, one of the things I love about the Three Questions podcast is that from time to time, I'll meet some really interesting people who maybe don't fall into the typical stocks and bonds, tax planning, estate planning space. And when we had a chance to meet and connect, it was like, this is somebody I got to have on my podcast. So I'm really glad you could make time for us. So before we get to our three questions, why don't we take a couple minutes for you to give us a chance to talk about your law firm, you know, who you are, what you do, and really what makes your practice so unique.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm based in New York City, and my firm is a boutique firm, and it's focused on planned giving for givers and getters. So what that means is whether it's for estate planning, you're giving your assets, whether you're a nonprofit receiving assets, or if you're that sliver of clients who want to do planned giving, that's who we work with.
Perfect. Now, just as an aside, I found this really interesting. Your firm has worked in a paperless environment for a little while now. I have to ask you what that transition is like for you and for your clients.
Yeah. Well, when I started the firm, that was my goal, which is almost unheard of for trust and estates
Exactly.
Unheard of. But it was intentional, right? I said, let's try it. I was fortunate or unfortunate, how you look at it, to start my practice during COVID, when most people were open to not meeting in person, not touching paper because we didn't know what was happening. So it was an opportunity to see how my clients would respond to it. And fortunately, they embraced it for the most part.
Well, I'll tell you, my tippy toeing into that paperless water started with something, I don't know if I want to call it an acute or chronic note taker, but I always love taking copious notes when I have meetings. And, you know, before in the, you know, I would say it almost lines up with COVID, pre-COVID and post-COVID, is I had like notepad after notepad after notepad. And finally, I was introduced to something called the Remarkable.
I have one.
And then, yes, was life-changing for me. because now all of my notes, when I take notes, my notes are automatically saved to the cloud.
Mhm.
And, if my handwriting was better, if my handwriting was more legible, we could even, as you know, I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but you can convert those notes actually to like a Times Roman printed
Yeah,
document that you can, copy and paste. And but at worst, I have all my notes on my Remarkable, and the days of notepads for me are over. And to which
ditto.
I say yay. Um, okay, I was just curious about that. So far, like, for us, aside from me taking notes, obviously now most of the client documents that our clients have to sign off on, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, everything is done through DocuSign. So,
Mhm.
back in the day when I was in Toronto, back in Canada, I remember when I used to have to go off site, because I used to have like multiple offices in Toronto, North York, all over. I used to have to bring almost like a suitcase with me with my client files, and those days happily are mercifully over. Thank you. Okay, so we're talking about raving fan donors here, and those are giving like $500,000 or more. As you and I both know, they're driven by a mix of personal, social, and financial motivations. I guess the first thing I want to get to and get your thought on before we get to our official three questions is,
Mhm.
how important is it to understand these motivations in helping nonprofits navigate the balance of accepting large gifts while maintaining their mission? Like how much is that conversation happening in advance?
Well, it depends on the timing, right? Sometimes a charity receives, as you said, an outreach from a raving fan and says, we want to make this contribution to you. Sometimes they don't know, right? Maybe they're left a large bequest in someone's will or in someone's trust. So it really depends on whether the organization has good roots in their community to know who might be making a significant contribution and how that will tie into their overall goals. And we'll talk about that a little bit, when a large grant comes in, but being aware of where those large contributions may come from will help the organization shape its goals.
And just as a point here, like you said earlier, you could be on either side of the proverbial table here. You
Mhm.
could be representing the giver, or you could be representing the nonprofit. So you can look at it from both points of view.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to be discussing the three questions a nonprofit should ask when receiving large charitable donations. And our questions are from the perspective of the nonprofits themselves. Now, that said, if you're looking to make a donation, I would recommend that you listen very carefully as well. So, Jennifer, why don't we get right to our questions?
Yep.
Question number one. Will we jeopardize our tax exempt status if we accept this large donation?
Great question. So it depends. It depends if you're going to do your due diligence. But I'll say, as a quick answer, probably not. But let's talk about what a nonprofit has to do in order to preserve their tax exempt status. So let's talk a little bit about what a nonprofit is, what a charity is, and how it becomes a charity.
Okay.
So when an organization is created in the US as a nonprofit in any state, the default taxation for that organization is a private foundation. Unless the organization files for tax exempt status as a public charity or some other type of organization, whether that's an advocacy organization C4, a membership organization C6, a supporting organization A9, if they don't do any sort of action other than creating this particular organization, automatically they're subject to the rules of private foundation status. And that's important to know because that determines what the organization can do with its funds and what it must do. So number one, private foundations are generally grant-making organizations. That means that they must make grants to public charities of at least 5% of their assets on a rolling 5-year basis. Those grants have to go out from the private foundation to a public charity.
They have to, of the amount of money they accumulate, they bring in, they have to distribute 5% on
Absolutely.
over a 5-year period or annually over a 5-year period.
Annually, every single year. The
So,
amount is determined based on the average of the prior 5 years.
so does that
So
mean in theory that the first 5 years that a nonprofit is established, they have a bit more flexibility and as to how much they give out? Or, I mean, because it's basically over there's that first 5-year period. In theory, they could either give out less or more in that 5-year window before you can actually do any kind of a sort of an actuarial analysis.
the answer is yes. And that's the case for private foundations and for public charities. They have a ramp up period. So most organizations, they try to anticipate what the amount is going to be so that they're in line with it. And nonprofits are given that grace period in order to establish themselves and confirm that their status is actually going to meet what they applied for based on their actual financials. So
They
the
could,
answer
in
is
theory,
yes.
potentially, depending on how much they receive, they could in the 5th year or 4th year, ramping up to the 5th year, may need to make a much more significant donation than they made in their first couple, 2, 3 years, depending on how inflows of capital have accumulated.
Right. And it's based on their income as well. So that's kind of the difference with private foundations and public charities is that private foundations, they have to pay a tax on their income, and it's also includable in the calculation of what amount they have to give out as a 5%. Public charities do not have to pay taxes on the income they receive from the assets that they're investing.
So just for the sake of interest
Mhm.
here, you know, there's the term we hear, or the type of nonprofit we most often hear about is a 501c3. So what can you tell our audience about that designation?
So it's important to understand that the 501c3 encompasses private foundations and public charities. They're both 501c3s, but you have to make an affirmative selection if you want to be taxed and treated as a public charity with the benefits that come with that.
Got it. So what ultimately, I knew this was going to happen. I warned you. I said, we're going to start talking, and I'm going to have back more and more questions. And this is exactly what's taking place, which is great. So how does one decide which route to take in terms of whether they want to be public or not?
Yep, great
There
question.
has to be some kind of motivation here.
Primarily, it's going to come down to where they are receiving their contributions. So if they are expecting large contributions from a small number of donors, they're probably a private foundation.
Got it.
If they are expecting large number of contributions from a vast number of individuals, that's probably going to be a public charity. That's number one. The second is, what is the activity of the organization? If the activity of the organization will essentially be to help other charities, having the funds, investing them, determining on a yearly basis which public charities they would like to support, not actually carrying out the charitable activities, that's probably a private foundation. If they want to carry out charitable activities and there's all these unrelated people, they say, we want to do this great thing for the community, that's a public charity. So
Their
how
boots on the
involved?
ground, if their boots on the ground, actually rolling up the sleeves, they're going to be the public charity. The ones who just basically are doling out the money they're going to be the privates.
Yeah, and I'll
Mhm.
mention that there's actually one that's a hybrid. It's a private operating foundation. And it's essentially a private foundation that gets the benefits of a public charity because it's carrying out the charitable activity, even though most of the contributions are large contributions from a small number of people.
Interesting. Okay, I have one more follow-up question before we move on. So what are the most common red flags nonprofits should watch for in regards to that large donation that we were talking about, and that could trigger the IRS to get involved?
Yeah. So it's really important to understand what is a public charity versus what is a private foundation. Because
Okay.
if the public charity cannot satisfy the test, which is determinative of having public support, it will lose that public charity status and be treated as a private foundation for that tax year. So that's the risk, right? So understanding what's the potential downside if they don't follow the IRS rules to safeguard that donation, it can create havoc if they lose their public charity status and are not treated as a private foundation. One of the big ones is they're going to have to make a 5% contribution to other charities. A second one is that donors who make a contribution to a public charity, there is a much higher AGI deduction threshold, which is about 60%, depending on the type of contribution. If an individual makes a donation to a private foundation, it's much lower. It's 20 or 30%. So if you have someone who made contribution thinking they were going to get up to 60% of AGI as a deduction, suddenly the organization didn't do the right thing to ensure they maintain that public charity status. All those donors that were relying on that 60% AGI
We're
might
going to be
now
in for
have
a bit
to,
of a surprise.
they're going to be in for a surprise, right? They're not going to be too happy. So it's making sure that they are proactive if someone makes a contribution or approaches them about making a contribution that is higher than what they normally receive. And the IRS has certain factors to determine if it will approve that particular grant as an unusual grant. That's a term of art, so that it's not counted as part of the public charity calculation, which is 1/3 of contributions have to come from the general public.
All right. Well, you know what? We're off to a good start. We're joined by Jennifer Abelay. She's an attorney based out of Manhattan, and her expertise is in advising nonprofits and also donors to nonprofits. And we're I don't think we're successfully addressing the 3 questions nonprofits should ask before they accept large donations. And we're going to go on to question number 2, Jennifer.
Mhm.
And that is, how much donor involvement do we have to allow once we've accepted these large donations or a large donation?
Some.
So, we
Essentially,
didn't
I'll
hear it
say,
depends.
I'm
I'm pretty
not going to
impressed.
say it depends. I intentionally did not say that. I
Yeah.
said some. So let's put it this way. For a donation to be proper under IRS rules, a donor has to give up full control, right? They cannot maintain any sort of control over the donation, which means they can't be the ones saying, I want to be the one deciding how this money is going to be used.
Mhm,
I need to give the final okay.
mhm.
They can't do that. All right. There are ways for donors to continue to be involved, and it can be from as minimal as receiving reports from the charity on how the funds are being used, just as a status update, to possibly being on an advisory board that makes some sort of recommendations or considerations on how the funds can be used. If it's going to be set up in that way, it should generally be part of the negotiation when that gift is set up. So if you're going to set up a large gift or receive a large gift, that needs to be negotiated as part of the agreement. What is
Before
the
they receive the
involvement?
donation, it's basically
Yes.
all the upfront. Yeah,
Yes.
you didn't surprise me with your response regarding the board, because that was the first thing that came to my mind. And again, I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on TV or
Mhm.
anything like that, but it was the first thing I thought of. Well, we'll make this donation, but we also want a seat at the table, right? That was exactly.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I do have something else I was just thinking. so nonprofits, can they set sort of boundaries with donors early on in terms of that so that they have some balance in regards to that involvement? Especially when in that case where, I just said, they just said that, I'm going to give you a $500,000, $1 million donation, but, as a part of it, I want to be on the board. So how does a nonprofit kind of set boundaries to avoid a situation where this voice becomes overbearing for the rest of the board and for the overall nonprofit?
Yeah, well, one way to set boundaries is relying on the IRS rules, right? Because the IRS identifies someone as a substantial contributor to the board if they have made a percentage amount calculated by the IRS in contributions. By having a substantial contributor on the board, they are automatically deemed to have influence and could potentially jeopardize the organization's tax exempt status. So one way is to say, well, we want to make sure this charity maintains its tax exempt status.
If
You
have too
want
much
that to
influence,
happen.
you could affect everyone's tax status.
Essentially. So they can't have a direct or indirect influence on the decisions being made by the organization. And for a substantial contributor, that goes to everyone around them. So they can't have their spouse having a direct or indirect influence, their kids,
It can't be
their employee, their cleaning lady. It can't be anyone that's in their circle. So you can't say, I'm the donor. I know I can't be on the board.
But I
But you
got
know
my
what? My
nephew over here
daughter,
who's
my
gonna sit on
nephew,
the board.
they would love to be on the board. So it extends that far, and that person is deemed to be a substantial contributor for 10 years from the time that the contribution is made. So that's one way, is just make sure you don't run afoul of the substantial contributor rules.
All right, so we've addressed how to receive the donation. We've addressed how to make sure that the donor doesn't have too much influence over how the funds are used. So our third question is this: what are the restrictions in regards to how the donated funds are used by the nonprofit? Jennifer, take it away.
Refer to the gift agreement first. The gift agreement controls. I mean, Wayne, you work on trusts as well. So when people ask, what do we do? Look to the trust instrument. This is the same thing. Look to the contract. What does it say? Generally, nonprofits have to comply with something called the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. That's a mouthful. Every state has some version of this, and it directs how the funds have to be used, how they have to be managed, and how they can modify any donor restrictions if that's possible. So that's what are the responsibilities? There are two types of endowments that are common. There's actually four that we know of, but I'm going to just mention restricted and unrestricted endowments. Unrestricted endowments is what they sound like. Make a large contribution to the organization, and they can do whatever they want with it. Restricted endowments is what most people think about when they talk about endowments and gift agreements. It's exactly what it sounds like. The donor has placed restrictions on how the funds can be used, what they can be used for, how long they should be used, whether the income only is going to be used, if they can be dipped into principal in any case. Does the principal amount have to remain the same, or can it go down if, let's say, there's a bad year? If they can't take enough income because there was a bad year, is it averaged over a certain number of years? So that's where we consider what can the organization do based on the agreement.
Yeah, okay. I just couldn't help but think that, as time passes and things change, a nonprofit's priority might shift, right? And so this is after accepting a large donation. So can this nonprofit legally redirect funds from where the initial, from the standpoint, just pretend here that I'm the donor, you're the nonprofit, I give you a large donation, everything's going swimmingly, but the focus of the nonprofit changes. So how does that affect how the large donation is used, or can there any changes be made?
So the answer is No. Without some sort of oversight and approval, usually by the Attorney General of that state or by the court that has jurisdiction. That's
Interesting.
under the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. It says that the donee must use the funds in accordance with the restrictions placed by the donor.
Interesting. So even if there was a negotiation between the nonprofit and the donor, you would still have to go through that process?
It depends on the state. That's a really good question. So, for example, most of these NIMFA acts, with institutional funds, they do have carve outs on when an organization can use the funds for something else. Generally, there has to be less than, let's say, $25,000 to $100,000. It can't be used for anything else. The organization absolutely needs it for its ongoing concerns. In New York, even if you meet these qualifications, you still have to go through the Attorney General, even if it's in the agreement. There's no way around it. And, I have had that situation where nonprofits say, but why is this money tied up? We can use it for other things. This is what the agreement says. I say, okay, let's go to the Attorney General. And then they get cold feet, right? Because it's not an easy process. So it depends on the state. In New York State, I can say that you have to still go through the Attorney General, even if it's in the gift agreement. But by having it in the gift agreement, it's more information for the Attorney General to show that this was contemplated, this was the donor's intention for the funds to continue to be used, even if it's for something different. So having that in the gift agreement is going to be very important if that situation arises.
We've been talking about, the three questions, nonprofits would ask before accepting a large donation. I am going to turn the tables here before we wrap up. And, given the fact that you do advise donors, I think we should spend a couple minutes on that. So from your point of view, how can donors, collaborate with attorneys like yourself, with financial advisors like me, to craft a large gift that maximizes their tax benefits without, overburdening the nonprofit and also not liquidating themselves at the same time? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. If there's a planned gift that a donor is contemplating, understanding what it's going to do for their financial picture is really important, because understanding what kind of assets are ideal assets to contribute is going to be a factor, not just for the donor, for their own balance sheet, for their tax filings, but also for the donee. Because I have had situations where someone makes a gift to a charity, let's say in a will or a trust, and the charity says, we're not doing that. And now you have to go through what is called the New York cypre proceeding, where you have to file a petition with the court, and they're the ones that ultimately decide what happens to the fund. So you absolutely want to have all the parties involved. As a donor, you want to have your financial advisor involved to see, what does it look like if they contribute X amount? What does that mean for their finances now and later? And that's something I don't do. That's what the financial advisor does, is they say, this is what you should contribute over this amount of time. How should we set that up? That's something we talk about together. Do we set up a charitable trust, and eventually the beneficiary is a charity? Do we set up a private foundation, which is a heavy lift? Do we do something a little bit more accessible, like a donor advised fund? For a donor, it's meeting them where they're at. So if someone has been just writing a $500 check to their favorite charity every year, and suddenly they say, well, I want to set up a private foundation. I say, well, let's talk about that. That's a lot of work. What is your vision? What are you trying to accomplish? And let's have you wade into this process as opposed to just jumping
into the deep end of the pool.
Yeah. Donors, what they should ask for is, if they are getting into a gift agreement, have the organization that's receiving it have an expenditure and investment policy in place, a spending policy in place, conflicts of interest in place? How are the funds going to be kept in their investment account? Is it to be segregated or not? So these kinds of questions are essential when it comes to a donor. If a donor wants, let's say, naming rights, how are those naming rights going to be determined? When will they place the name on the wing, let's say, of the school? Will it come down if someone makes a bigger contribution? On the flip side, the charity might want something called a bad boy a guarantee, that if something goes wrong that makes the charity look bad, that the donor did, all right, we want to be able to get out of this. So it's what is going to be the ultimate legacy of the donor. That's generally what I see for donors, is what is their legacy going to be, and how are they going to be assured that the charity is in the best position to carry that out?
Well, I will let the cat out of the bag on one thing. We are actually in an upcoming episode yet to be recorded. We are going to be talking about charitable remainder trust. So this is kind of a nice little segue to continue that discussion. Now, those watching on our website, we've included your information on the screen. Everybody can see how to contact you. But we have folks that are listening in on their iPhones or on their phones. They maybe listen to Apple or Spotify. So they don't be able to see how to get a hold of you. What is the best way for a listener to get a hold of you if they want to learn more about, either from the perspective of someone working with a nonprofit or a potential donor? How do they get a hold of you?
So the best way to find me is on my website. I'd say that's kind of a central location. It's abelailaw@abelailaw.com. Or someone can just shoot me an email. My email information is on the website, jva@abelailaw.com.
Perfect. Jennifer, thank you so much. You have been so incredibly informative today. It was a delight to have you, and look forward. You know what? This doesn't have to be a one-off. If you have any really important information about charitable giving and making large donations or receiving them, I would love to have you back on the podcast.
Great. Thank you so much. I'd love to come back.
Yeah, pleasure's mine. Jennifer Abelai is a Manhattan-based attorney with Abelai Law PC, and she was an awesome guest today. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I look forward to bringing you the Three Questions podcast, and I hope you find them educational and informative. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our podcast and YouTube channels. And to receive a notification of when our latest episode has been posted, please click on the notification bell. Lastly, to schedule an online consultation with me to discuss your wealth management needs, please click on the link in the description box below, www.onecapital.com/meet with Wayne. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.